Police officer arrests black woman at airport on suspicion of crime, but suitcase shocking inside. In today's gripping video, we dive into a shocking incident that unfolded at a bustling airport. A black woman was arrested by a police officer on suspicion of a crime, leading to a dramatic turn of events that left many onlookers stunned. What was in her suitcase? This story takes unexpected twists that will leave you questioning preconceived notions and the nature of assumptions. If you're excited about this story, please let us know. If you enjoyed the video, please press 1. If not, press 0. Your feedback has inspired me to collect more uplifting and meaningful stories.
Imagine boarding a flight, carrying with you one of the highest honors in the nation, a symbol of years of dedication and sacrifice. But instead of respect, you're met with suspicion, whispers, and an escalating storm of assumptions. This is the story of Amara Johnson, a decorated black woman whose journey home took a shocking turn when her suspicious luggage led to a confrontation that would expose more than anyone expected. What was inside the case, and how did it change everything? Let's dive into this extraordinary tale of resilience, justice, and karma. The bustling terminal at Pearson International Airport buzzed with energy as travelers hurried to catch their flights. Among them, Amara Johnson moved with quiet purpose. Dressed in a tailored black blazer and carrying a sleek silver briefcase, she exuded an air of authority that made people glance twice but never approach. Her demeanor was calm, but her eyes darted across the crowd with an almost imperceptible vigilance, a habit ingrained by years of service in high-stakes environments. As Amara reached the gate for her flight to Washington, D.C., she paused to survey the scene. Her flight was already boarding, with passengers forming two distinct lines, one for economy class and another for first class. She adjusted the strap of her modest carry-on bag and stepped into the first-class line, earning a curious glance from the gate agent. "Good evening, ma'am," the agent said, her tone polite but tinged with something unspoken. Her eyes flicked to the silver case in Amara's hand. "May I see your boarding pass?" "Of course," Amara replied, her voice steady and unyielding. She handed over the ticket and ID with a faint smile. The agent inspected them briefly, then hesitated. "Ah, thank you. Enjoy your flight." The pause lingered, but Amara chose to ignore it. She had seen this before, too many times to count. Inside the cabin, Amara made her way to her seat near the front of the plane. The plush leather seats and subdued lighting offered a stark contrast to the chaos outside. As she placed her briefcase carefully in the overhead compartment, a flight attendant named Sarah appeared beside her, smiling too brightly. "Can I help you with that?" Sarah asked, her gaze fixated on the case. "No, thank you," Amara replied politely, locking the compartment with a quick, fluid motion. She took her seat and buckled in, her movements deliberate, as if choreographed. Sarah lingered for a moment longer than necessary. "Is there anything valuable in there? It looks heavy." Amara's brow furrowed ever so slightly, but she maintained her poise. "Just personal items," she said, her tone firm enough to end the conversation. Sarah nodded, but her curiosity was piqued. She walked away, glancing over her shoulder as she whispered to another attendant, who quickly joined her in stealing glances at Amara's seat. The plane filled with passengers, and the murmurs of conversation grew louder. Amara opened her leather-bound notebook, skimming over notes she had jotted down earlier in the day. The briefcase sat securely above her, but she could feel the weight of the flight crew's stares. She had learned to read people, trained to notice the slight shifts in body language, the quick exchanges of glances. Something about her presence, or her luggage, had unsettled them. Sarah's colleague, a younger attendant with a nervous energy, approached the co-pilot during the final boarding checks. "There's something weird about one of the passengers," she whispered, glancing toward Amara's seat. "She has this case, and she's different. I think we should keep an eye on her." The co-pilot raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" "You know." She trailed off, unable to articulate her bias without revealing it outright. "Just unusual," the co-pilot sighed. We can't afford any mistakes. If you think something's off, report it. Sarah nodded, her suspicions now amplified by the co-pilot's tacit approval. She returned to the cabin where Amara sat calmly, oblivious to the storm brewing around her. As the flight prepared for takeoff, Amara closed her notebook and leaned back into her seat, her eyes fluttering shut. For the first time that day, she allowed herself to relax. Her thoughts drifted to the award ceremony she had attended the previous evening. It had been a surreal experience, standing in the Oval Office, shaking hands with the president, and receiving one of the nation's highest honors for her years of dedication and sacrifice. Yet, despite the accolades, moments like these reminded her of the battles she still fought daily. The plane's engines roared to life, and as they ascended into the clouds, Amara remained unaware that her journey home was about to take a sharp and unexpected turn. The hum of the plane's engines settled into a steady rhythm as the flight leveled off. Amara opened her eyes and glanced at the flight status on the monitor above her seat. 2 hours to Washington, D.C. She shifted slightly, the leather seat cool against her back. Despite her outward composure, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Years of experience had sharpened her instincts, and they were rarely wrong. Across the aisle, Sarah lingered near the galley, her eyes fixed on Amara. She fiddled with a coffee stirrer, her mind racing. The briefcase, sleek, metallic, and locked, didn't belong to someone like her. Or so Sarah thought. She whispered to her colleague Matthew, who was busy organizing the meal service. "I'm telling you, it's suspicious," Sarah said in a low voice. "Who brings a case like that on a flight? And she's so reserved." Matthew raised an eyebrow, glancing toward Amara. "You're overthinking it. Maybe she's just a businesswoman. First class is full of them." Sarah frowned. "No, it's more than that. Did you notice how she refused to let me help with it? She's hiding something." Matthew shrugged, returning to his task. "You're imagining things. Just focus on the service." But Sarah couldn't let it go. She stepped closer to the cockpit and knocked lightly on the door. The co-pilot, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, opened it, his headset slightly askew. "What's the issue?" he asked, his tone brusque. "It's the woman in 2A, Sarah began, lowering her voice. "I think we need to alert someone. Her luggage, it looks off, and she's acting suspicious." The co-pilot sighed. "We're in the air, Sarah. Unless there's a clear threat, we're not making any calls. If you're that concerned, file a report when we land." "But—" "No buts." He cut her off, glancing at the passengers behind her. "Unless you see something definitive, let it go." Frustrated but undeterred, Sarah returned to the galley. Her resolve only deepened as she watched Amara quietly jotting notes in her notebook. Every movement seemed deliberate, calculated. It made Sarah uneasy. Amara, oblivious to the scrutiny, focused on her writing. She was drafting a letter to her mentor, a retired general who had been her rock during her years in the intelligence community. Her thoughts flowed easily as she penned words of gratitude and reflection. The hum of the cabin faded into the background. Then a shadow fell across her notebook. She looked up to see Sarah standing there, a strained smile on her face. "Can I get you anything, ma'am?" Sarah asked, her voice overly sweet. "No, thank you," Amara replied evenly. She could see the question lingering in Sarah's eyes, the one she wasn't brave enough to voice. Sarah hesitated, then gestured vaguely toward the overhead compartment. "If you need help with your case, just let us know." Amara's lips curved into a polite smile. "I appreciate it, but I'm fine." Sarah lingered a moment longer, before retreating to the galley, her frustration mounting. She exchanged another glance with Matthew, who shook his head as if to say, "Let it go." But Sarah wasn't ready to let go, not yet. The atmosphere in the cabin grew tense as meal service began. Sarah's interactions with Amara became increasingly strained, her forced politeness teetering on the edge of hostility. Amara noticed, of course. She always noticed. But she chose to say nothing, her years of discipline urging her to pick her battles wisely. When the meal service ended, Sarah made her way to the rear of the plane, where she found a quiet corner to make a call. She dialed the airline security desk, her voice hushed. "This is Flight 218. I need to report a potential security concern," she said, glancing around to ensure no one overheard. "Yes, it's a passenger in first class, seat 2A. She's carrying a suspicious briefcase." The voice on the other end was calm but firm. "Can you confirm if she's made any threats or acted aggressively?" "No," Sarah admitted reluctantly. "But her behavior is odd, and the case—" "Ma'am, we can't escalate a situation based on speculation. If you believe there's an immediate threat, you'll need to inform the captain." Sarah hung up, her frustration boiling over. She felt certain she was right. Amara was hiding something. Meanwhile, Amara settled back in her seat, closing her eyes. She had no idea that her briefcase, containing one of the nation's highest honors, had become the center of an escalating paranoia. Nor did she know that her calm exterior was fueling assumptions that had nothing to do with her actions and everything to do with her appearance. As the plane continued its journey through the night sky, Amara's thoughts drifted to her family waiting in Washington. She didn't know that her landing would be far from ordinary, that her quiet strength would soon be tested in a way she hadn't anticipated. In the galley, Sarah made her decision. If no one else would take her concerns seriously, she would ensure someone did upon landing. The police would be waiting at the gate. The flight landed smoothly at Washington Dulles International Airport, the aircraft's gentle jolt stirring passengers from their mid-flight slumbers. Amara opened her eyes, her senses immediately alert, as she glanced out the window. The familiar city lights stretched out before her, but something felt off. She couldn't place it, just an intangible sense that something wasn't right. As the plane taxied to the gate, a curt announcement crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that you remain seated after landing as we handle a minor security matter. Thank you for your cooperation." Amara's brow furrowed. A minor security matter? She cast a discreet glance around the cabin. Several passengers exchanged puzzled looks, but most dismissed it, assuming it was a routine procedure. Amara, however, knew better. Her years of experience told her that minor rarely meant unimportant. The plane came to a stop, and the flight crew moved with a peculiar tension. Sarah's face betrayed her excitement. Her chance to prove she was right had arrived. She whispered to Matthew, who looked more uneasy than ever. "They're here," Sarah said, her tone triumphant. "Sarah, are you sure this is necessary?" Matthew asked, glancing toward the front of the cabin where Amara sat, her posture upright and calm. "You'll see," Sarah replied, brushing past him. Outside, the bright red and blue flashes of emergency lights reflected on the terminal windows. Amara noticed them immediately, her heart sinking slightly. She had seen this kind of scene before, an overreaction brewing into a storm of complications. She felt the weight of the situation before anyone said a word. Moments later, the cabin door opened and the unmistakable sound of boots echoed down the jet bridge. Uniformed officers entered the plane, their presence imposing as they scanned the cabin. Whispers rippled through the passengers. Amara sat still, her hands resting on her lap, her face composed. She had no reason to panic, but she knew better than to underestimate the situation. "Passenger in seat 2A, please remain seated," one officer announced firmly. The rest of the passengers were instructed to stay put as the officers approached Amara. The lead officer, a tall man with a serious demeanor, addressed her directly. "Ma'am, we need you to step off the plane with us," he said, his tone authoritative but not aggressive. Amara met his gaze steadily. "May I ask what this is about?" "It's a routine matter. Please come with us," he replied, his evasiveness telling her all she needed to know. With a nod, Amara rose from her seat, retrieving her carry-on and the silver briefcase. She moved with practiced grace, her head held high. The murmurs of other passengers grew louder as she walked down the aisle, flanked by officers. Some looked on with concern, others with curiosity or judgment. Sarah stood near the galley, her expression smug, as if her suspicions had been vindicated. In the terminal, Amara was led to a private room where more officers waited, along with airport security personnel. The atmosphere was heavy with tension. One officer gestured toward the table in the center of the room. "Place the case on the table, ma'am," he instructed. Amara complied, setting the briefcase down carefully. She straightened, clasping her hands in front of her. "What exactly is going on here?" The lead officer hesitated before answering. "We received a report about your luggage. We need to inspect it." "A report?" Amara repeated, her tone calm but sharp. "From whom?" "That's not relevant right now," he replied. "We just need you to unlock the case." Amara studied him for a moment. She could see the discomfort in his stance, the way he avoided meeting her eyes directly. He wasn't sure of himself, which meant this wasn't standard protocol. It was fueled by something else. Still, she knew resistance wouldn't help her case. Without a word, she entered the code and released the latches. As the case opened, the room fell silent. Inside, nestled in a protective velvet lining, lay the gleaming Presidential Medal of Freedom, accompanied by an official certificate signed by the President of the United States. The officers stared, their confusion giving way to shock. One of them muttered, "Is this real?" Amara's voice cut through the silence. "Yes, it is. I received it yesterday for my contributions to national security. I was returning home when your team decided I was a threat." The lead officer stepped back, his face flushing. "Ma'am, we didn't realize—" "No, you didn't," Amara interrupted, her tone still measured, but carrying an edge. "You made an assumption, and now you've humiliated me in front of a plane full of people and delayed my journey because of it." The room was thick with unease. Sarah entered timidly, having been summoned by one of the officers. When she saw the contents of the case, her face turned pale. "Is this the passenger you reported?" the lead officer asked her. Sarah nodded weakly, unable to meet Amara's gaze. I thought—" "You thought wrong," Amara said, her voice calm but cutting. "And now you've not only wasted everyone's time but also shown how dangerous unfounded assumptions can be." The officers quickly apologized, stumbling over their words as they tried to salvage the situation. Amara remained composed, her silence more powerful than any words she could have spoken. She closed the briefcase and turned to leave, her dignity intact despite the ordeal. As she walked back into the terminal, she felt a surge of mixed emotions: anger, exhaustion, and an undeniable pride in how she had handled herself. She knew this wasn't the end of the matter. There would be consequences for the airline and its staff. But for now she focused on one thing: getting home. In the distance, she spotted a young black girl holding her mother's hand, watching her with wide, admiring eyes. Amara smiled softly, giving the girl a small nod. If nothing else, this moment would remind her why she fought so hard. For herself, and for the ones who would come after. The car ride from the airport to her home in Washington, D.C. was quiet, save for the hum of traffic. Amara sat in the back seat of the town car, her silver briefcase resting beside her. The ordeal replayed in her mind, each detail sharp and unrelenting. She had faced worse situations during her career, but the personal nature of this incident cut deeper. This wasn't about her professional achievements. It was about her existence, her identity. She glanced at the briefcase, a symbol of the honor she had received just hours before. The irony wasn't lost on her. Decorated by the president one day, treated like a criminal the next. Amara took a deep breath and closed her eyes, grounding herself. This was far from over. By the time she reached her home, a modest but well-kept townhouse in a quiet neighborhood, it was nearly midnight. Amara stepped inside, the familiar scent of lavender from her essential oil diffuser immediately soothing her frayed nerves. She placed the briefcase on her desk in the study, its metallic sheen catching the dim light. Before she could settle, her phone buzzed, She glanced at the screen. Director Sullivan. Sullivan was her former superior at the Department of Defense and one of the few people she truly trusted. She answered, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. Amara. Sullivan's deep, measured voice came through. I just received a call from Dulles. Are you all right? I'm fine, Amara replied, her tone betraying none of the frustration simmering beneath the surface. It was an inconvenience, nothing more. Inconvenience? Sullivan's voice sharpened. They detained you over a briefcase containing the nation's highest civilian honor. That's more than an inconvenience. It's an embarrassment, and it needs to be addressed. I appreciate your concern, Amara said, sinking into her desk chair. But I want to handle this my way. There was a pause before Sullivan replied, Understood. Just know, if you need support, I'll make sure you have it. Thank you, she said, meaning it. As the call ended, she leaned back, staring at the briefcase. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had been judged unfairly because of how they looked. The next morning, Amara arrived at the headquarters of the airline, a sleek glass building in downtown D.C. She had spent the night preparing a detailed report of the incident, outlining every misstep by the flight crew and security personnel. She hadn't contacted the press or sought public attention. Her aim was systemic change, not a spectacle. Inside, the air was cool and sterile, the lobby bustling with employees and travelers. A receptionist greeted her with a professional smile, her demeanor shifting slightly when Amara introduced herself. I'm here to meet with Mr. Harrison, Amara said, referring to the airline's chief operating officer. The receptionist nodded quickly. Of course, Miss Johnson, please have a seat. 15 minutes later, Amara sat across from Harrison in a spacious conference room. The COO, a tall man in a tailored suit, wore an expression of contrition that Amara had seen before, a mix of discomfort and fear of bad publicity. Miss Johnson, Harrison began, let me start by saying how deeply sorry we are for what happened. This incident does not reflect our values as an airline. Amara studied him for a moment, letting the silence stretch before responding. Your values may not reflect it, but your actions did. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was the result of unchecked bias. Harrison shifted uncomfortably. We take allegations of bias very seriously. The flight attendant in question has already been placed on administrative leave. That's not enough, Amara interrupted, her tone calm but firm. This isn't just about one person. It's about a culture that allowed her assumptions to escalate into a public humiliation. What are you going to do to ensure this doesn't happen again? Harrison hesitated, clearly unused to being challenged so directly. We're reviewing our training protocols and considering additional diversity initiatives. Considering? Amara raised an eyebrow. This isn't a matter for consideration. It's a necessity. She slid the report across the table. Here's a detailed account of what happened, along with recommendations for systemic changes. This includes mandatory bias training for all employees, clear protocols for handling security concerns, and accountability measures for incidents like this. Harrison flipped through the report, his expression growing increasingly grave. This is comprehensive. It has to be, Amara replied. Because if this isn't addressed, I will make sure it reaches the people who can force your hand. And trust me, they'll be less patient than I am. After the meeting, Amara left the building feeling a sense of resolve. She wasn't naive enough to believe change would come easily, but she had planted a seed. It was up to them whether it would grow or wither under scrutiny. As she walked toward her car, a voice called out behind her. She turned to see a young woman, one of the airline employees, approaching hesitantly. Miss Johnson, the woman said, her voice tinged with nervousness. I just wanted to say thank you for speaking up. People like me, we notice. Amara smiled, her resolve strengthened. You're welcome. And remember, you have a voice too. Don't be afraid to use it. The woman nodded, her expression one of quiet determination. That evening, As Amara sat in her study, she opened the briefcase one last time. The metal gleamed under the desk lamp, a reminder of her journey and the battles she had fought, not just for herself, but for others. This incident wasn't the end. It was a chapter in a much larger story, one she was determined to write with courage and purpose. For Amara Johnson, the fight for justice was never over, and she was more than ready to continue it. 2 weeks had passed since the incident at Dulles International Airport, and Amara's life had returned to its usual rhythm, or so it seemed. While she had moved on outwardly, the experience had left a mark that refused to fade. Her days were filled with meetings, speaking engagements, and quiet moments of reflection. But the memory of the officers, the briefcase, and the stares from the passengers lingered. Her report had been delivered, her voice heard. Yet Amara knew from experience that systemic change rarely came without persistence. Amara's phone buzzed on a rainy Tuesday morning. She glanced at the screen and saw the name. Office of Senator Charles Whitmore. Whitmore was a longtime advocate for civil rights and one of the most powerful voices in Washington. "Miss Johnson," his assistant said when she answered, "the senator would like to meet with you regarding your recent experience with Global Wings Airlines." Amara agreed. Her curiosity piqued. A meeting with Whitmore wasn't something she took lightly. By late afternoon, she found herself in his stately office on Capitol Hill. Senator Whitmore, a tall man with a commanding presence, greeted her warmly. "Amara, it's an honor. I've followed your career for years. Your courage and integrity are an inspiration." "Thank you, Senator," Amara replied, shaking his hand firmly. "I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me." They sat, and Whitmore leaned forward, his expression serious. "Your report on the airline incident crossed my desk last week. It's thorough, painfully so. I've seen far too many cases like this, but yours carries a unique weight. We need to act." Amara raised an eyebrow. "What do you have in mind?" "I'm introducing a bill," Whitmore said, sliding a folder across the table. "The Passenger Dignity Act. It mandates comprehensive bias training for all airline personnel and establishes federal oversight for incidents of discrimination in aviation." Amara opened the folder, scanning the draft legislation. It was bold and ambitious, exactly what was needed. "This is impressive," she said, "but it'll face resistance." "Of course," Whitmore replied with a small smile. "That's why I need someone like you to testify. Your voice will add the weight this bill needs." Amara considered his words carefully. She had always been more comfortable working behind the scenes, letting her actions speak for themselves. But this was different. This was bigger than her. "I'll do it," she said finally, her resolve firm. The congressional hearing took place 3 weeks later, and the room was packed. News of the Passenger Dignity Act had spread quickly, and Amara's testimony was one of the most anticipated moments. As she stepped into the chamber, she felt the weight of countless eyes on her. Cameras clicked, capturing her poised figure as she approached the witness stand. She wore a simple navy suit, her silver briefcase once again at her side. Senator Whitmore opened the hearing with a fiery speech about the pervasive issue of discrimination in the aviation industry. Then it was Amara's turn. She took a deep breath, her voice steady as she began. "Good morning. My name is Amara Johnson. I'm here today not as a former intelligence officer or a recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom, but as a woman who was judged unfairly because of how I look." The room was silent, every word she spoke resonating deeply. She recounted the incident with measured detail, balancing emotion with professionalism. She painted a vivid picture of what it felt like to be singled out, humiliated, and forced to prove her worth in a situation where none of that should have mattered. As she concluded, she said, "This is not just my story. It's the story of countless others who face this kind of prejudice daily. We have the power to change that, and we must." The hearing sent shockwaves through the industry. Global Wings Airlines issued a public statement acknowledging its failure and promising sweeping reforms. Their CEO, James Riley, reached out to Amara personally, requesting a meeting. Amara agreed, though she approached the meeting with skepticism. They met in a neutral space, a conference room in a downtown law office. "Miss Johnson," Riley began, his tone earnest, "I want to apologize personally for what happened. We've reviewed your report thoroughly and we're taking immediate action." Amara listened as Riley outlined their plans: mandatory bias training, a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination, and an independent oversight committee to handle complaints. It was more than she had expected, but she wasn't ready to commend them yet. "Talk is easy, Mr. Riley," she said. "Implementation is harder. I'll be watching." Riley nodded. "I wouldn't expect anything less." That evening, Amara sat on her back porch, a cup of tea warming her hands. The city skyline glittered in the distance, and the air was crisp with the promise of winter. Her phone buzzed with messages of support, from friends, colleagues, even strangers who had seen her testimony. But one message stood out. It was from the young woman at the airline, the one who had thanked her outside their headquarters. The message read, "Because of you, they're listening. Thank you for giving us hope." Amara smiled, her heart swelling with a quiet pride. This was why she fought, why she pushed through the discomfort, the doubt, the fear. Change was slow, often painfully so, but it was possible. As she sat there, she thought of her parents, who had raised her to believe in the power of resilience and justice. She thought of the countless people who had come before her, paving the way for moments like this. And she thought of the young girl at the airport, whose wide eyes had carried both admiration and hope. For Amara, the fight wasn't over, it never would be. But in this moment, she allowed herself a rare feeling: satisfaction. She had taken a stand, and the ripples were already spreading. The world wouldn't change overnight, but it would change, and she would be there, every step of the way. Weeks turned into months, and the Passenger Dignity Act steadily gained traction in Congress. Amara found herself unexpectedly thrust into the spotlight. Invitations to speak at conferences, appearances on national news, and countless messages from individuals who had faced similar discrimination filled her days. Though she had never sought fame, she understood the responsibility that came with her growing platform. Amara's life was no longer just about advocacy in Washington. It was about ensuring the promise of change reached those who needed it most. One brisk morning, Amara stood at the lectern of a grand conference hall in New York City. The audience was a mix of airline executives, government officials, and civil rights leaders. Behind her, a screen displayed the words, "The Future of Equity in Air Travel." Amara's voice rang out, steady and commanding. The airline industry isn't just about transportation. It's about trust. Every passenger who steps onto a plane does so with the belief that they will be treated fairly with dignity and respect. When that trust is broken, the consequences extend far beyond a single incident. They erode the fabric of our society. She paused, scanning the room. The tension was palpable. Some executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others nodded in agreement. "The Passenger Dignity Act isn't a burden," she continued. "It's an opportunity. An opportunity for this industry to lead the way in dismantling systemic bias and creating a model of equality that others can follow." The room erupted in applause as Amara stepped back from the lectern, her words leaving a profound impact. Despite the bill's progress, opposition began to surface. Some members of Congress, backed by powerful corporate interests, argued that the legislation was too punitive. They claimed it would place unnecessary burdens on airlines, increasing costs and inconveniencing passengers. Amara anticipated this resistance and doubled down on her efforts. She organized town halls, met with policymakers, and leveraged her connections in the intelligence and defense communities to amplify her message. Her network proved invaluable, with influential allies like Senator Whitmore and retired General Sullivan working behind the scenes to garner support. One evening, during a private dinner with Sullivan, she voiced her frustrations. Sometimes it feels like we're taking one step forward and two steps back. The opposition is louder than I expected. Sullivan, ever the strategist, leaned back in his chair. True change is never easy, Amara. But you've already done the hardest part. You've made them listen. Now, it's about staying the course. Amara nodded, his words a reminder of the resilience she had cultivated over years of service. Not all moments of progress were on grand stages or in policy meetings. One day, while traveling through Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, Amara stopped for a coffee before her flight. A middle-aged black woman approached her, hesitating before speaking. "Miss Johnson?" the woman asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Yes," Amara replied with a warm smile. The woman's eyes filled with tears. "I just want to thank you. My son, he's 16, was stopped by TSA last year for no reason. They treated him like a criminal, and it broke him. But when he saw your testimony, something shifted. He said, 'If she can stand up to them, so can I.' You gave him his confidence back." Amara felt her throat tighten. She reached out, placing a hand on the woman's shoulder. "Thank you for sharing that with me. Tell your son that his strength is what inspires me." As the woman walked away, Amara stood for a moment, absorbing the weight of her impact. It was these personal stories that reminded her why she couldn't stop fighting. Months of lobbying, debates, and amendments culminated in the day of the vote. Amara sat in the gallery of the House of Representatives, her heart pounding as the roll call began. Each aye brought a flicker of hope, each nay a pang of doubt. The final tally appeared on the screen: 217 for, 214 against. The Passenger Dignity Act had passed. The gallery erupted in applause, and Amara found herself enveloped in Senator Whitmore's bear hug. "You did it," he said, his voice full of pride. "No," Amara replied, tears welling in her eyes. "We did it." With the legislation signed into law, the real work began. Amara was invited to join the newly established Civil Aviation Equity Commission, overseeing the implementation of the act. She traveled to airline headquarters across the country, leading workshops and working closely with executives to ensure the changes were more than symbolic. At Global Wings Airlines, the company that had sparked the entire movement, Amara conducted a surprise inspection. She noted the improvements, clearer protocols, visible accountability measures, and a noticeable shift in employee attitudes. Yet, there was still work to be done. As she concluded the visit, she encountered Sarah, the flight attendant who had reported her. Sarah approached hesitantly, her face a mixture of shame and gratitude. "Miss Johnson," Sarah began, her voice wavering. "I want to apologize. I made assumptions that day, wrong assumptions, and I've thought about it every day since. Your actions changed more than just the airline. They changed me." Amara studied her for a moment before responding. "Acknowledging your mistake is a step in the right direction. What matters now is what you do going forward." Sarah nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "I won't let it happen again." As Amara boarded her flight back to Washington, she felt a sense of accomplishment, but knew the journey was far from over. Her work had sparked a movement, but maintaining momentum required vigilance and persistence. Seated in first class, her silver briefcase beside her, she gazed out the window at the runway below. The world outside was ever-changing, turbulent, and full of challenges. But Amara Johnson had never been one to back down. She closed her eyes, the hum of the engines steadying her thoughts. Tomorrow would bring new battles, new opportunities to fight for justice. And she would be ready. For Amara, this was more than a chapter. It was a legacy in the making.